Judiciary Committee will please come to order, a quorum being present. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2 and House Rule 11, Clause 2, the Chair may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote for the ayes and nays are ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up the Chair's resolution authorizing the issuance of certain subpoenas for documents and testimony for purposes of markup, and move that the committee agree to the resolution. The clerk will report the resolution.
Resolution offered by Chairman Gerald Nadler. Resolved that upon the adoption of this resolution, the Chairman of the Committee on the Judiciary is authorized to issue subpoenas for the documents and testimony from current and former administration officials relating to the following. 1. The zero-tolerance policy and other family separation policies and practices. 2. Detention or short-term custody of children and/or families. And 3. Discussions about or offers of presidential pardons to Department of Homeland Security officials or employees. In addition, the Chairman, as his discretion, and
without objection, the resolution is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Today, the Judiciary Committee will take additional important steps toward greater oversight of the Trump administration in two areas: immigration and alleged obstruction of justice. First, immigration. Over the past several months, we have held hearings and sent letters to the agencies of jurisdiction regarding a series of catastrophic and inhumane immigration policies. Many questions remain, and it is past time that we hold this administration accountable. In January, as one of my first acts as chairman, I sent letters to the then Department of Homeland Security DHS Secretary Nielsen, then Acting Attorney General Whitaker, and current Health and Human Services Secretary Azar, asking that they preserve and turn over any information and records pertaining to the development and execution of the administration's so-called zero tolerance, which really meant family separation, immigration enforcement policy, and the detention of migrants. I am pleased to say that DHS and HHS have, for the most part, complied with this request. However, in a span of 6 months, the Department of Justice has produced only a smattering of heavily redacted emails. And yet together, these documents represent the administration's most substantive response to the various immigration-related inquiries we have made this Congress. In April, we requested documents and information regarding troubling reports that the administration was considering retaliatory actions against certain members of Congress who the President deemed to be in opposition to his funding and policy priorities. That the President openly discussed this tactic on social media shocks the conscience. After sending a follow-up letter, we were told by agency officials that because these actions were never executed, there was no need for the disclosure of related documents or information. That, however, is for Congress to decide, not the administration, whether we need that information and those documents. In May 2019, along with several of my Judiciary Committee colleagues, I wrote to DHS demanding an immediate investigation into the deaths of 5 migrant children at the southern border over the last 6 months, as well as a committee member briefing on conditions in short-term holding facilities. Having been to El Paso twice this year, I was already aware that conditions were deplorable and unacceptable. And with the release of 2 DHS Office of Inspector General reports, my concerns have grown exponentially. To date, DHS has not provided a single briefing or any response to the letter. I use these examples to highlight the scope of serious concerns we have raised with the administration and the systematic withholding of information from the Congress, despite our oversight responsibility on behalf of the American people. We have given the administration ample time to respond to these serious reports of egregious conduct. This committee cannot sit idly by. There must be oversight and accountability. On that subject, in April 2019, along with Zoe Lofgren, chair of the Immigration and Citizenship Subcommittee, and Steve Cohen, chair of the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties Subcommittee, I sent a letter to Acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAleenan, requesting information and documents related to President Trump's reported offer to pardon him if he were to illegally close the southern border, as the president had reportedly suggested he should do. A follow-up letter was sent on May 29th, but we have yet to receive any response to these inquiries. That matters because it represents a very serious threat to our rule of law system. And it brings me to the other group of subpoenas we are authorizing today. And let me just elaborate. For a president, now these are allegations and news reports, which we want to check out. For a president to order an administration official to violate the law and to say, don't worry, if you violate the law, I'll pardon you, would be a terrible dereliction of duty and a terrible violation of the president's duty to see that the laws are faithfully executed. Be an open invitation to violate the laws. And this brings me to the other group of subpoenas we are authorizing today. These 12 subpoenas relate to the committee's ongoing investigation into allegations of obstruction of justice, public corruption, and abuses of power, including such conduct described within the scope of the Mueller report. The special counsel, who will be appearing before this committee next week, found in his report that the Russian government attacked the 2016 U.S. presidential election in, quote, sweeping and systematic fashion, unquote. The report also detailed 10 instances of possible obstruction of the investigation of that most serious matter, as well as other possible misconduct. The Committee on the Judiciary has a constitutional obligation to investigate credible allegations of misconduct. We have been doing that through pursuing the unredacted Mueller report and key related witnesses and documents. There is no substitute, however, for primary evidence as the committee makes its decisions, which is why we have sought documents and testimony from former White House counsel Donald McGahn, former White House Communications Director Hope Hicks, and former Deputy White House counsel Annie Donaldson. Today we focus on 12 additional witnesses. These include government officials who worked or continue to work in close proximity to the president. These witnesses also include those outside of government who have critical information in connection with our investigation. We will not rest until we obtain their testimony and documents so that this committee and Congress can do the work that the Constitution and the American people expect of us. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And here we go again on another round and episode of premature subpoena authorizations, brought to you by the Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee. Aside from the lack of specificity, the lack of a lot of things, and the lack of maybe a law school understanding of a subpoena, this is again another trek down an empty road. In the world of congressional oversight, today's markup makes absolutely no sense. First, we have the zero tolerance policy. This is an area where the chairman has sent one single request to the administration way back on January 11th, 6 months ago, and not a single follow-up request since. Nevertheless, since the administration has produced a steady stream of documents, the Department of Health and Human Services made a total of 20 productions, nearly one per week, for over 7,500 pages. Department of Homeland Security has made over 4 productions, including one earlier this week, amounting to over 3,300 pages, as you can see in the boxes beside me. The Department of Justice has provided 6 productions totaling over 1,200 pages. In sum, the administration has voluntarily made 29 productions totaling over 12,000 pages, yet the chairman, out of the blue and without a single formal follow-up, wants to issue subpoenas for more documents. Second, the chairman wants to issue a subpoena for information regarding the detention of children and families and a subpoena for information about the discussions or offers of presidential pardons to DHS officials and employees. The chairman has only tangentially issued a document request regarding detention way back in January. A subpoena here is not only premature, but unjustified. The chairman has zero predicate for this markup today. Given this fact, I guess the chairman was telling the truth when he said during an earlier subpoena authorization, he views the subpoena as the beginning of a dialogue process. Third, the chairman wants to continue a subpoena binge and issue additional 12 subpoenas to individuals related to the Mueller investigation. The chairman has made no formal contacts with 3 of these individuals during his chairmanship, and the subpoena will in fact be, I guess as we've heard, the beginning of a dialogue process. Once again, I want to emphasize, the chairman has not sent even one written request to 3 of the individuals on this list we are authorizing. 4 of the individuals were part of the chairman's short-lived and now defunct investigation into the 81 Trump associates. Each of these individuals responded to the chairman, cooperated with his inquiry before that investigation seemingly has died on the vine. Incredibly, another one of these individuals has already received a subpoena from the chairman. He produced documents as well, but I guess the chairman is going to reward him with yet another subpoena because apparently the first one wasn't good enough. I guess there wasn't enough dialogue. Again, the record is devoid of any basis for subpoena authorizations. At least the chairman is consistent. This is a pattern we have seen several times before. If you cooperate with him, you get a subpoena. If you ignore him, he'll leave you alone. In the world of congressional oversight, these subpoenas make no sense at all. But in the world of politics, today's markup makes perfect sense. When we left for the July 4th recess, my friends on the other side were reeling. They were having a very large and very public inter-party squabble over funding for humanitarian crisis at the border. The crisis this committee has repeatedly failed to address. Before we ever get back to town, however, we were greeted by the chairman's intention to go on a subpoena binge, attempting to change the narrative to focus on issues he hasn't touched for months, if at all. This is a very haphazard way of conducting congressional oversight. It's no wonder other committees have taken the lead on investigating the issues the chairman wants to focus on today. The Judiciary Committee, as it has been for months, is trying to play catch-up. For example, Chairman Cummings issued subpoenas to DHS, HHS, and DOJ regarding zero tolerance policy back in February, 5 months ago. HPSI has been consistently leading the way in regard to the Mueller investigation. One of today's subpoenas is for Michael Flynn, a person HPSI is close to bringing in after issuing him a subpoena last month. In addition, the chairman refused for months to review the lesser redacted Mueller report and held the Attorney General in contempt. Meanwhile, Adam Schiff cut a deal with the department and got access to the underlying documents. If the goal is truly to get information or testimony, our chair is failing. But as is repeatedly said, if the goal is to political theater, we're winning. Chairman Schiff also threatened to subpoena special counsel before the July break. He fulfilled his promise and in doing so forced the chairman's hand. Now, instead of having hearing where all of our members get to ask Robert Mueller questions, we're having our legs cut out from under us by limiting the questions. Not all Republican members will be able to ask questions, and not all Democrat members will be able to ask questions. This is an odd format, is the result of the chairman's not taking seriously this information and moving forward, and we're all here to suffer. In fact, let me just bring up, it's against House rules, but that's another problem we've never had a problem with here, it seems like, in the last 6.5 months. And the Democrat member of this committee are not happy about it. Today's subpoena binge is an effort to change the narrative. It's a show of force. It's a chance for the chairman to prove to his rank and file and the rest of the Democratic caucus that we can be tough on the Trump administration after being pushed around for 6 months. Today is a chance to show that we have what it takes and will not bow in the spotlight. However, the truth is at this point, next week, a hearing on one of the largest, most talked about investigations in 2 years, and this committee got rolled. Intel Committee gets to ask all their questions. This committee does not. This committee gets to divide in the haves and the have-nots. We're all elected, both sides. This is a farce, especially when it flies in the face of a 5-minute rule that is conveniently being ignored. Here we go again, and as I've had to say for the past 6.5 months, let the show begin.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to a resolution offered by Mr. Nadler. Strike all after the resolving clause and insert the following. That upon the adoption of this resolution, the chairman of the committee...
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. My amendment in the nature of a substitute makes no substantive changes to the resolution and simply makes a technical revision to former Attorney General Sessions' name as stated in the resolution. Therefore, I urge adoption of the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for any comments he may have on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no real comments about the amendment in the nature of a substitute, except the the broadness of this, the lack of specificity of this, the understanding of looking at it and saying, what do we want? And also, as I stated in my opening statement, we're here again for show. This committee has become run by press release when we can't do substantive work. This is not the way subpoenas are supposed to work. This is not the way congressional oversight is supposed to work. And for those of us who hope to be in the majority again one day, quit ruining it for the rest of us. Because this is not the way subpoenas are supposed to work and oversight is supposed to happen. There's been no follow-up on many of these. Some of these have never even gotten the first request for even helpful. And the ones who have responded are now getting served with another subpoena. Wow. Let's keep going. I yield back.
Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? In that case,
Mr. Chairman, move to strike last word.
the gentleman from Ohio. What
Thank you, Mr.
purpose does the
Chairman.
gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, despite the fact that millions and millions of taxpayer dollars and 22 months were spent on an investigation and a report that determined that there was no collusion by the Trump campaign with Russia, and the Attorney General concluded that there was no obstruction of justice, the majority continues on what clearly is a fishing expedition. Yet more subpoenas here today. I agree completely with the ranking member. This is much ado about wasting this committee's time and avoiding other issues which are within our jurisdiction, which we continue to avoid. It's really a faux impeachment, a fake impeachment to satisfy the hardcore Democrat base who hate this president, who despise the fact that he's still in the White House and in fact, despise the fact that he was ever there. Now this committee has allowed itself, as the ranking member said, to be rolled, run over, roughshod by the Intelligence Committee. It's really embarrassing for a committee that really has had significant stature in this House for so many years. Rather than wasting more time on this fishing expedition, we could be spending our time on things that really matter, on things that would actually benefit the American people. For example, we had nearly 250,000 people enter our country, flow into this country at our southern border over the last 2 months alone. Think of that, 250,000 people in 2 months. And most of those came in through our very flawed asylum process, which we ought to be able to come to some bipartisan agreement if we'd actually talk about it, discuss it, have hearings on that issue. It's so flawed. We have people that are paying drug cartels to come here. The money's flowing back there. When these people are coming in at one point, people are literally coming down. You can watch TV. They're coming down loaded with drugs in boxes right down the way from that, because our border is so unprotected at this point and putting the American people at risk. That's something, immigration, asylum, et cetera, is within the jurisdiction of this committee. But we essentially ignore that over and over again. And as I said, the cartels are making huge amounts of money at this. This is putting American people at risk. We had 70,000 people who died of drug overdoses last year. 70,000 people, drug overdose, most of it opioids, much of it fentanyl, for example. That issue is essentially ignored by this committee. Those people, by the way, when they come here, they're told the so-called magic words by the cartels, again, who are making the money. They come into the country. They're given a court date 2 to 5 years down the road. About 10% actually show up for the court date. The other 90% or so completely ignore it. They're put on a bus. They're put on a bus or a plane, shipped off to some place in the country, our congressional districts here, and they essentially disappear in the population. And that photo, which I think a lot of us really, it hit us, that father and that young child that died, that drowned coming into our country. A horrible incident, never should have happened. But we should not forget that our policies, as they remain, or our lack of policy, lures these people to our country. The young women, the mothers and fathers who literally give birth control to knowing that their daughters, there's a reasonably good chance that they're going to be raped by the coyotes or the other people that are bringing them up here. So it's just horrific. That's the kind of stuff that we ought to be dealing with, but instead, more subpoenas, more wasting this committee's time. It's really a shame. This committee ought to be better than this, has been in the past, hopefully will be in the future, and I yield back.
For what purpose is the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition? Use your mic. Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, just a little chronological history. Let me acknowledge the importance of this subpoena on a number of bases. But my friends on the other side of the aisle, and certainly those who are here in 2013, remember that the brunt of what we're facing today falls at the very feet of this House and the Republicans. Because in 2013, there was a bipartisan bill that came to the House from the Senate, 68 to 32, led by John McCain. I think even Chairman Graham was on the bill, and now Chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that was to address the problems of the American people as it relates to immigration. It was a pathway to citizenship. And the members of this House, Democrats, were prepared to work with the bill. We had a bill, and we were prepared to work with the bill and then go to conference. But the Republicans didn't want to answer the call of the American people, fix the broken immigration system. Now, I've just come back from the border, and I can assure you that children are still being separated from their families. Children are still being housed, and the reason why they are housed as children labeled unaccompanied, because I asked the question, did they become unaccompanied because you separated them from their families? Yes, that's how they became unaccompanied. And so it is important to note the zero policy still effectively undermining what I think the American people are most outraged about, is the care and responsibility for these children. Now, if you go and talk to migrants one-on-one, they will tell you that, as they were told me, their son was murdered. They went to the grocery store and came back and saw their nieces and nephews drugged by someone who had broken into their house, and they had to escape with their life. These are migrants who are on the other side of the border in Juarez. The policy that the president says that is working, I have no quarrel with the Mexican government. They did whatever they had to do diplomatically. But there are no work permits. There are no facilities that these migrants are supposed to stay in. They have no guarantee that they won't be thrown out into the street because there are no places for them to stay. There's no health care. And yes, they are human beings. So it is important for us to be able to utilize our authority, our oversight responsibility, to ensure that the Flores case is adhered to, that there is a short-term custody. Now we understand that there's a massive 700 per child day private prison being built somewhere with no authority from the United States Congress, wasting money, reprogramming, taking money. But yet they couldn't take money, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. They couldn't take money to answer the call for toothpaste and toothbrushes. They couldn't reprogram the money in the DHS. They continued to whine about the Congress was not responding. That's not accurate. Our hearts were torn. The American people are torn. They're concerned about these children. It is crucial for us to respond to them. And then to be able to deal with the litany of individuals from Mr. Dearborn to Flynn to Jody Hunt, Mr. Kushner, Kelly, Lewandowski, Porter, Rosenstein, Mr. Sessions, Mr. Davison, and Mr. Howard, Dylan Howard, and Pecker, to be able to continue the oversight that is the responsibility of this committee, because the American people are asking to be informed in a way that they can understand the enormity of what has occurred in this administration. We may soon hear an announcement about the census in complete contrary to the Supreme Court decision. This administration will stand up to the Supreme Court and tell them that they are not worthy of their name and begin to issue executive orders on the question of citizenship, on the census. So I don't have any doubt that this subpoena is for non-political purposes. It is for purposes of information, and it certainly is for purposes of dealing with the important question of the responsibility of this Judiciary Committee. And finally, I would argue the point that offers of pardons and questions regarding Homeland Security officials are important, inasmuch as, Mr. Chairman, they are announcing raids that are going to frighten everybody and maybe put everyone in danger and separate more children from families again. I think that it is important that we move forward with this resolution for subpoena. With that, I yield back.
For what purposes, For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very quickly, since this is about the subpoenas, let me just first respond. There is, and I'm glad to see my friends on both sides of the aisle, or other side of the aisle, have joined us on this side of the aisle in acknowledging there is a crisis on our border. We have been battling while in the majority. We had a few join the Democrats that didn't want to secure the border, but the failure to secure the border is what has caused this crisis. The failure to, the promises of legalization, amnesty, better living conditions, all these kind of things have continued to lure more and more people here. Now, if we didn't have immunity in Congress, then you could have the survivors of those who have died trying to get here, or the hundreds of thousands potentially that have been personally harmed, raped on the way here, maybe millions. They would have lawsuits against members, but we have immunity. But we know in our evolved system of justice that if you have, for example, a swimming pool in your yard and you fail to put a fence around it or a wall around it, and somebody comes in and is harmed, drowned, they have a potentially major verdict they're going to get against the individuals who refuse to put a wall or a fence around an attractive nuisance. That's the legal term, not mine. That's what has been created by our friends across the aisle, an attractive nuisance that has lured people to their death, to horrible living conditions. And then when this administration is begging for beds to take care of these people, we were told that the crisis created by the refusal to secure our border didn't exist. Oh, it's a manufactured crisis. It doesn't exist. And so I'm glad at least we now have those people that stuck their head in the sand and said there was no crisis, now acknowledging that there is a crisis. But let's be real about what created it and what will solve it, and continuing to encourage people to come from around the world in greater numbers than ever is not the fix. Now, with regard to these subpoenas, if I put my role and robe back on as a judge or chief justice and think about, because that's the way you have to look at these things, well, will a federal court enforce the subpoenas? You would want to see, what was the process? What is this about? Well, it's about the Mueller report. Well, what did you do? Well, we first subpoenaed Barr because we said it was a summary. He said it was just to get out the conclusions because he knew the report was coming. But we subpoenaed him, even though that's totally irrelevant if you want to know what the report said. And then we finally got around to having an agreement for Mueller to come testify. But I'm telling you, if you had told me 6 months ago that Chairman Schiff would be able to marginalize the Judiciary Committee and Chairman Nadler, I would say that will never happen. I found otherwise. Our committee has been rolled on our jurisdiction over special counsel. That is our jurisdiction. The members on both sides of the aisle ought to all be able to ask questions and not be marginalized by the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. But we got rolled. And so if you're the court looking to see, because about the only other way to enforce a subpoena and a contempt, it would be if you arrest them and put them in our little cell up here. But otherwise, you got to get a federal court on board here with you. And when they see the process that's been followed here, it doesn't make sense. It makes it clear. Maybe this subpoena is an effort to make it look like we're trying to get back our jurisdiction from the Intelligence Committee. But whatever the case, this is going to damage future majorities, regardless of which side of the aisle. It is a terrible precedent. And that's why these subpoenas should not be coming now. Instead, we ought to be demanding full time to question Mueller about the report, then issue subpoenas if necessary for the witnesses that make up that report if we're not satisfied with Mueller. That would impress a judge, and short of that, these subpoenas will be meaningless. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I move straight to the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I can't start without just making clear what everyone on this committee knows, what everyone in America knows. The United States of America is not an attractive nuisance. The United States of America is a beacon of hope and opportunity to people around the world, as it has been since our founding. Now, I strike the last word to speak out strongly in support of the subpoena authorization. I would expect bipartisan support for these authorizations. First, for the list of individuals related to the committee's investigation into obstruction of justice, public corruption, and other abuses. I've heard many times from my Republican colleagues on the other side of this dais that they don't want expert witnesses. They want the people who were there. Well, this list should satisfy them. These are the key players, both in our ongoing investigation and in the Mueller report. That's exactly what my Republican friends have been asking for. Up to this point, unprecedented obstruction by the White House has blocked testimony and appearances by the people who were there. But we will not stop in the face of baseless claims of immunity or privilege. I thank the chairman for his continued work in pressing this committee's work forward, and I hope that the minority will join us as we continue this important investigation. Secondly, this authorization also authorizes subpoenas for information related to the detention or short-term custody of children and or families by the Trump administration. That's the administration whose policy dictated tearing kids from their parents. It's the same administration that has put kids in cages. Mr. Chairman, in the days before the committee's February 26th hearing on immigrant detention, the administration dumped thousands of pages of documents on the committee. Within those pages, we found reports of incidents of sexual assault and misconduct involving unaccompanied children in the care of the Office of Refugee and Resettlement. Those incidents included 154 staff on unaccompanied minor allegations of sexual assault. And now this week, NBC News reported new allegations against Customs and Border Protection agents. A 16-year-old boy alleged that the sleeping mats were removed from his cell after he complained about the drinking water. A 15-year-old girl alleged that she was sexually assaulted by a CBP officer when he groped her in what was meant to be a routine pat-down. While some of these incidents are reportedly under investigation by DHS's Office of Inspector General, they demand full congressional oversight and swift accountability. We cannot stand by and hope that the Trump administration does the right thing, because time and time again, they do not. And it is children who are paying the price. Kids, innocent kids. We've seen it with our own eyes. Many of us have seen the conditions these children are kept in, from Texas to my own state of Florida. We cannot stand by and think that the Inspector General will just simply handle it. We can't stand by and wait for a response to our multiple letters. This is urgent. We cannot stand by and ignore our duties as an independent branch of government. And, Mr. Chairman, we absolutely cannot stand by and allow human rights to be violated beneath the American flag. If the administration is going to continue its unprecedented obstruction, we will continue to respond. Today, we authorize an important step forward in providing oversight of an administration that simply must be reined in. I thank the chairman for his leadership, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
You know, Mr. Chairman and members, I am absolutely disgusted by the obsession that is going on here of trying to undermine the President of the United States. And, you know, and then to hear that, you know, we're not doing, the Republicans aren't doing anything about immigration. Are you freaking kidding me? I mean, we have immigration bill after immigration bill that members have submitted and are in front of this committee that have not even been heard that could help solve this problem. And then I'm really irritated that next week we're going to be questioning Robert Mueller, and I don't even get a chance to question him. This is just plain wrong. I've been elected just like anybody else here, and for the leadership in this committee to decide that only certain members, and there's only time for certain members to be questioned, even on your side of the aisle, is just plain wrong. And I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from California, for what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Let me just begin by saying that I think for the last several years, until January of this year, the Republicans controlled the presidency, the Senate, the House, and comprehensive immigration reform was not passed. Earlier this year, there was a child welfare case in California involving the abuse and captivity of 13 children. The parents were charged with abusing and imprisoning the children, only allowing them to eat once a day and to shower infrequently. These parents are serving life in prison for their crimes against their children. Today, the Department of Homeland Security is imprisoning children in crowded cells for extended periods of time without adequate food, supervision, medical attention, or access to basic hygiene needs like soap, toothpaste, and toothbrushes. Children are suffering in detention from the flu, chickenpox, and measles. In every state in this country, this is child abuse, child neglect, medical neglect. A state child welfare agency would remove the children from these conditions and arrest the parents. By the way, it's never routine for an adult male to pat down a female child. That is never routine. We cannot tolerate state-sponsored child abuse. The Department of Homeland Security says they don't have the money to treat the children better. We provided $4.6 billion to address the humanitarian crisis at the border and specifically said that the money could not be spent to build additional detention centers. Yet DHS is expanding for-profit immigration detention centers in states far from our southern border. They found money to expand for-profit detention centers, but somehow they don't have the money to provide soap, toothbrushes, and medical attention for children. John Kelly, President Trump's former chief of staff and Secretary of Homeland Security, during the family separation pilot program, now serves on the board of the company that was handed a $341 million no-bid contract to run the Homestead Center, an influx detention center for children. The company that runs the center charges $775 per day per child, yet children in detention have access to only the most basic services, and then oftentimes not. There are foster parents in this country who don't get $775 a month to care for a child. The untold story of this debacle is the corrupt windfall of dollars that businesses are making. In February of 2018, I received reports in my office that a large number of infants and toddlers were sent to the Office of Refugee Resettlement Services. These are services designed for older children who typically arrive at the United States border alone. We couldn't understand how infants and toddlers were crossing the border alone. They weren't coming alone. They were stripped from the protective arms of their family when they crossed the border together. More than 2,500 children were separated from their families under the administration's zero-tolerance policy. The administration said that this policy was ended, but it was not ended. Children are still being separated from grandparents, from aunts, uncles, siblings, and in whose world are these not families? It is a lie that the administration ended this policy of breaking up families. This is about punishing children and families so they can send a message back to their Central American countries to not come to the United States. CBP agents don't have adequate training to determine whether a child is abused, and there are no clear standards for what criminal convictions constitute a danger to a child. There is no due process and no judge to determine the best interests of children at the border. We are using law enforcement to address a humanitarian crisis. I have been to refugee camps in South Sudan and Uganda. Children are never separated from their parents. What is going on at the border is an embarrassment to our nation. There is a crisis at the border, a crisis that has been fueled by an administration that refuses to address the root causes. Why do people leave their countries? Dollars should go to help the Central American countries, not cut aid. We need these subpoenas to get all the facts about family separation policy and to get the facts about how agencies are awarding contracts. The administration hasn't responded to our letters, and we now need subpoena authority to end the unconscionable treatment of children, immigrants, and asylum seekers. Thank you. I yield back my time, which has expired.
I thank the gentlelady. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The hypocrisy in this room today is staggering. To accuse the dedicated men and women who serve our nation in the Border Patrol as child abusers is simply despicable. They are doing everything they can under the most difficult of circumstances to provide for the needs of these children who have been brought here illegally, in large part in response to the promises of free health care, free legal representation, even being shielded from deportation after committing crimes in this country. To equate our Border Patrol to child abusers, I think just goes beyond the pall. And to hear claims of kids in cages under Trump. I'd bring to the majority's attention the report yesterday in the New York Post, which pointed out the Democrats on the House Oversight Committee sent out a pair of tweets Wednesday and earlier this month with photos of migrants sleeping in a detention center to publicize an immigration hearing in Capitol Hill. Just one problem. The pics were snapped in 2014 during the Obama administration. The Dems deleted the two messages and claimed it was an error. I think a lie would be more appropriate. Mr. Chairman, this is a committee that has been chaired in the past by giants of our history, men like James Buchanan, Daniel Webster. When we speak of an abuse of power, I think the real abuse of power is right here before us today. 12,000 pages of material have already been produced for this committee. I wonder if we've even read them. 3 of the 12 subpoenas are of people for whom we have not requested any information yet whatsoever. When the subpoena process is abused to this extent, it cheapens the moral and legal authority of all subpoenas of the House and the moral standing and authority of the Judiciary Committee that it may well very need to summon in the future. In fact, I think our stature has already been diminished and compromised. We've seen that already, the dramatic truncating of our legitimate authority to question the special counsel. This committee has already been eclipsed, I think precisely because of the way it has comported itself, and that's obviously a decision that's been made by the Democratic leadership. The executive and legislative are separate and co-equal branches. They cannot interfere with the internal functions of the other, and the frivolous and indiscriminate abuse of the House's subpoena power can only be interpreted as an attempt to interfere with the executive's function by tying down key officers with unlimited demands to produce paperwork. And this is not a new issue. Congress has tried to do the same thing to Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, Carter, both Bushes, Clinton, and Obama, with the same results. And the courts consistently backed the presidency. The Congress even tried to subpoena Truman and his subordinates after they left the White House, and the courts said the same immunity applies. If this is an impeachable offense, then I think every president since I was born would have been impeached. Many of the, I think the Democrats on this committee are suffering from what the Air Force calls target fixation. That's the phenomenon when pilots focus so much on the target that they fly their plane into a mountain. Many of their candidates in Trump districts ran as self-described problem solvers. Instead, I think people are seeing they're not problem solvers, but troublemakers, and they're the ones who are going to be most likely held to account. The first calls for Trump's impeachment came 1 week after the 2016 election. Our chairman was caught openly plotting impeachment just days after the 2018 election put him in charge of the Judiciary Committee. Mr. Chairman, democracy depends on the willingness of all sides to accept the result of an election. And that didn't happen this time, and that's a very dangerous phenomenon in a nation like ours. And meanwhile, the violent crime rate's rising. We have a crisis on the border, all matters that are under the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee, and all matters that have been unaddressed by the Judiciary Committee. In fact, to make matters worse, we just passed 3 bills out of committee last month to grant amnesty for millions of illegal aliens already in our country, which is sure only to attract more to attempt the dangerous and illegal crossing into our southern border.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
I'm
Would the
happy
gentleman
to
yield for a moment?
all of the time that
Would
I
the
have
gentleman yield
remaining.
for a moment? Thank you. I just want to agree with the gentleman that this committee has in the past been chaired by giants, but I would hardly consider James Buchanan among the giants. Gentlelady, I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. June 10th, 2018. That's almost 13 months ago, and that was the day that I became the first member of Congress to talk to family members who had been separated from their children. I went into a federal detention, into a federal prison where they were being held just south of my district. And I'll tell you, I wouldn't have gotten access to that place had it been a for-profit detention center, but it happened to be a government federal prison, and they actually believe in being accountable to the people that give the money. So I was able to get in and talk to over 226 mothers and fathers who had been separated from their children, separated at the border. At that point, sometimes for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, they did not know where their children were. Mothers who told me that they could hear their children crying for them and they could not go to them. Mothers who told me they were given slips by the immigration enforcement agents with the names of their children on those slips, except guess what? Those weren't their children. You know why? Because the immigration system, because the entire Health and Human Services system, nobody knew whose children belonged to whom. Nobody had kept track of them. Nobody had planned for this. Nobody knew what was going on. And in fact, if they did, they had actually told the higher-ups not to do this because it would cause lifelong damage to those children. And Mr. Chairman, we had White here, Commander White here, who testified to that with Scott Lloyd sitting right here next to him, that he had told Scott Lloyd that this would cause irreparable long-term damage to these children to be separated, in some cases for 7 and 8 months now. And you know what Scott Lloyd did? Nothing. Nothing. And on June 13th, 2018, 2 days later, I was in this committee sitting right there, controlled by Republicans, when this Republican majority refused to do a darn thing about these family separations. Not a single hearing, not a single hearing. And you know what? The country was outraged. It wasn't just Democrats. 2 weeks after I went to see those children, working with organizations on the outside, working with people who were outraged by what was happening, because this is not any kind of America. Not a Republican America, not a Democratic America. 500,000 people turned out into the streets to protest the family separation policy, the zero humanity policy. Laura Bush wrote a compelling op-ed. Franklin Graham, the evangelicals, spoke out. The churches spoke out. But you know who didn't? Do you know where there was complete silence on the issue of family separation? Right here in this committee from the Republican majority. Right here in this committee. So, Mr. Chairman, these subpoenas are not just appropriate, they are absolutely essential. Essential. We have had no accountability around this Trump administration's zero humanity policies. And we now know that the youngest child who was separated from his parents was only 4 months old. 4 months. We don't know this because the government disclosed this information. We know it because of a New York Times investigation. And according to the New York Times, immigration officials took 4-month-old Constantine away from his family when he requested asylum to an immigration officer stationed outside the American border. He followed the directions set out by then Secretary Nielsen, but immigration agents still took his son away. Constantine's dad finally agreed to be deported on the condition that he be reunited with his son. Immigration officials told him that Constantine would never be returned to him once he was on the plane, that he would be returned to him once he was on the plane, but Constantine never came. So despite the claims from the administration that nearly 500 parents chose to leave without their children, we have a clear example of coercion, of parents doing everything they could to regain custody of their children, only for our United States government to deny family unity. But we never had a hearing on family separations in this committee under the Republican majority. We have sent letter after letter after letter. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the Immigration Subcommittee Chair, Zoe Lofgren. Thank you to members of this committee, including Ms. Bass, Ms. Jackson Lee, who were with us on a trip to the border last summer, but nothing under the Republican majority. So don't tell me that we have done what we can. We have not done what we need to do, and that is why we need these subpoenas, because this administration is lawless and it trades in cruelty and in money. Let's be very clear that the for-profit detention facilities that John Kelly is now on the board of, after overseeing the implementation of family separation, is the company that is profiting off of the cruelty to children. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for doing these subpoenas. I am in full support, and I yield back.
Will the gentlelady yield?
The gentlelady's time has expired. For what purposes, the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I do appreciate the passion in this committee. This is a committee full of passionate people who think about issues deeply and care deeply. I also had an opportunity to visit multiple detention facilities and holding facilities. And I'll tell you, one of the ones I happened to be able to visit was a for-profit private ICE detention facility. And I didn't have the same experience as my colleague, but that's probably unique to me. I get that. But these subpoenas seem to be overkill in my mind. It's probably too early. I think that we can get these folks to come in. I think that we could negotiate this. But leaving that aside, I'm especially troubled by the format that's been reported to me will be for this upcoming Mueller hearing. So if we start 8 to 10 minutes late for that hearing, if we only have 2 hours, and then we're going to cede it over to the Intel Committee, Mr. Chairman Schiff, who's apparently running this in some respects, if we start 8 to 10 minutes late, as we did this morning, that will lop 2 people off who won't be able to ask questions if we adhere to the 5-minute rule. But we likely won't, because it's not unusual for individuals on the other side to be allowed to go over a minute or two in their questioning, not in the response necessarily of the witness, but in their actual questioning. And if there's some post-testimony commentary, which is sometimes the case, as we see, we've even seen here today, that will further erode the time. So if you happen to be sitting on the bottom row here and you have 1 hour, and you have 1 hour, that's the 2-hour limit. That means at 5 minutes you get about 11 people in. But when you start moving to these other things, you start lopping off members of that 11. And if you're not part of the 11, what are you? You're being treated unfairly and disproportionately. We've taken the forceful step as a committee, whether you agree or disagree, to subpoena Robert Mueller, the special counsel. It's our committee's jurisdiction. It's not the Intel Committee's jurisdiction. But we've done this ostensibly because we find his testimony to be valuable. So valuable that we're going to subpoena him in. But we're going to constrain the opportunities for members of this committee to ask questions. That's neither appropriate, it's neither fair, and quite frankly, it probably doesn't comport with the rules of this committee or the House. The chairman of our committee has said that witnesses shall not dictate the terms or conditions of their testimony. But that seems to be what's going on here today. Either that or Chairman Schiff is dictating, because we're getting only 2 hours. And then it's going to go to the Intel Committee. Well, that means not everybody on this committee is going to get the opportunity. And that means that we have a hierarchical system, a system that's based on preferential treatment, quite frankly, by where you sit on the committee. It means if you're in the front row, I happen to be on the front row. I was just inches away from the back row. But it means that membership of this committee is not democratic, and we're not going to all be treated equally. But I know everybody here has questions. So the Washington Times reported on a couple of my friends who sit on the front row, asking them, what do you want to ask questions of Mr. Mueller for? And they stated what they want to ask their questions. Bad news for you, because if you sit on the front row, you're not in that 11 most likely. And that means that you're probably not going to get to ask questions, the questions that you told the Washington Times that you wanted to ask, including me. I told them what I wanted to ask. So the way I view this is, if we're really going to go by the plan that we've heard that's been related to us, is that we're going to get an hour apiece and we're going to go the 5-minute rule, that means that my time to ask questions has been ceded over to the Intelligence Committee instead of this committee where we have jurisdiction. And that is really, really wrong. This is a committee that has a long and storied history, and we are undermining it by that type of session to the other committee, and by not allowing us to adhere to the rules, the 5-minute rules, so everyone gets to ask questions. That I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with great respect to my colleague on the other side of the aisle, I will say I'd like to bring this markup back to the fundamental issue before the committee, which is these critical subpoenas that we are poised to authorize on the administration's dangerous and disastrous zero-tolerance and family separation policies. That's why we're gathered here in this committee room today. And I share the concerns and empathize with the frustrations of my colleague, Representative Jayapal, who I thought articulated the sentiments of people in my district and in my state very effectively. I think many of my colleagues here on the committee know that I, like many others, am the son of immigrants, that my parents were refugees from East Africa. And so I understand the importance of immigrants to our communities and of the often difficult circumstances that have led many to seek shelter, refuge, and a home in the United States. And for some, coming to the U.S., it is a desire, and for some, it's a need. And regardless, immigration has certainly made our nation stronger in countless ways. And so I share the outrage by the continuing stories and the horrific images of the inhumane conditions immigrants at our border and at detention facilities across the country have been subjected to. We have heard deeply concerning reports over the last several weeks of children being housed in unsanitary facilities, sleeping on cold, concrete floors without proper medical care, toothbrushes, soap, windows, or proper nourishment. We cannot allow this treatment to continue under our watch. And I will say that these inhumane conditions are not just occurring on our southern border, they're happening in facilities across the country, including in my home state of Colorado. I continue to be alarmed, like many of my constituents, by basic human rights violations happening within a private detention facility run in Colorado. GEO Group is the largest private prison company in the United States and holds immigration and custom enforcement contracts to operate immigration detention facilities across the country. And as we have heard from my distinguished colleague, Representative Bass, and many others in the committee today, these private facilities benefit from limited oversight, and they operate under a financial interest in which they receive fixed payments from the federal government per individual. So the incentive is monetary, not the health and dignity of individuals. And so we see the result of that broken and absurd system when you have, at the facility that I mentioned in Colorado, subpar medical care and use of restraints on folks in solitary confinement, even Department of Homeland Security's own investigators raising various issues about the facility itself. And by the way, that's why I also believe this committee should hold a hearing on detention facilities, including GEO group in particular, and why I support Representative Jayapal's Dignity for the Detained Immigrants Act, which would end these for-profit facilities once and for all. Ultimately, for all these reasons and more, I think it's critical that Congress provide critical oversight of the continuing conditions at our border and of immigration detention facilities, especially in light of this administration's dramatic expansion of enforcement efforts at the border and numerous reports of detention facilities providing woefully inadequate medical care. The subpoena before us today will allow this committee to ask administration officials important questions about these policies and to hold them accountable, which it is long past time for us to do. And so I appreciate the chairman's leadership on this front, as well as Representative the Subcommittee Chairwoman Lofgren's leadership. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Dakota seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
And with all due respect to my friends on the other side of the aisle, not all these subpoenas are for zero tolerance policy. So we are talking about that. And we're talking about Jared Kushner, David Pecker, Rod Rosenstein, and we know full and well those aren't for those. So we have spent over 2 hours in hearings arguing about whether the Attorney General can be held in contempt for not violating the law. We've spent over 2 hours in these hearings talking to John Dean and 3 cable news pundits about whether there's obstruction of justice. We've spent 2 hours, over 2 hours in this committee talking about a bipartisan solutions to the Mueller report, which changed, the nature and the testimony brought to the hearing changed the day before. But we're gonna spend 2 hours and nothing longer talking to the guy who wrote the report. I joined Ranking Member Collins very early on saying, let's bring in Bob Mueller. He's the one who wrote it. Let's deal with it. Let's go through that. Let's have all of that. And now we've been dealing with these circus sideshow hearings for months. And we have been doing it constantly. And it's not because any witness that has been in front of those tables has had anything substantive to add to what has gone on in this report. It is a narrative. It is a messaging hearing. We've done them over and over again. And I've sat through every one. I try to be in my chair as much as possible. I try to contribute to the committee as much as possible. I find out this morning that next week, I have my constituency has no voice in this hearing. None. Not a single voice. I'm not going to be able to participate. And I'm not here to whine and kick dirt. Quite frankly, I don't think people sent me to Congress to whine and kick dirt. But I think it's unbelievably disrespectful to every member of this committee, and I think it's unbelievably disrespectful to my constituents to put those kind of parameters in place. So with that, I would kind of end on a question, and if we are gonna limit the guy who wrote the report to 2 hours of committee time, I'm hopeful that we are considering limiting all of these hearings we have with these subpoenaed witnesses to 2 hours at time, because if we're not going to spend more than 2 hours dealing with Bob Mueller while he's here in our committee, then I don't think we should be spending more than 2 hours dealing with any of his underlings that we're trying to pull in front of the committee for another sideshow. So with that, I yield back. Or yield to the ranking member.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. You make a great point. I mean, we had Hope Hicks for 8 hours. Hope Hicks for 8 hours on transcribed interview. I'm still waiting to hear from the chairman how he plans to get around the fact that we're breaking and violating the rules on the 5-minute rule and only limit it to 11 people. I guess they're gonna pull that magic, oh, we're gonna adjourn. That's not right. It's not right to your members. It's not right to this member. This committee got rolled, let's admit it. And we're in a position now to where you got members on our dais, you got a lot of members on your dais that I can see they're excellent attorneys that would ask great questions. But this is where we're at. And these subpoenas, and I would understand, look, we've never objected to having oversight hearings on the border or any part of it. This is the prerogative of this chairman. You could have these, and you're having some more next week, and there was no need for subpoenas there. Again, I think when you just look at it from a legal perspective and oversight perspective, the question becomes, is these are so broad in asking what we're looking for. I mean, come on. This is where we're having a problem. We needed to change the narrative today. This is what this is about. This is for that table right over there, and for those on the camera. This is what this is about. We need to have oversight hearings. We need to do an investigation of the border. We need to do these things. But also our members need to be able to talk to Robert Mueller. If he's actually going to come, then have that conversation. But when Intel gets to ask all of their questions, every member will get to ask questions. We don't. When we have jurisdiction primary of this, that's a problem. And you can argue that we need these subpoenas, and I appreciate my colleagues saying, yes, we need subpoenas. Fine. You're going to have the votes here in a minute to authorize these subpoenas. But again, let me just go back for just a second. Some of these have never had contact before, never been contacted by this committee, and we're leading with a subpoena. Okay, that's what we want to do. But at a certain point in time, I think it's a deeper issue that is very concerning, is that when over the last number of days, we've been given mixed reports every time we've almost asked on what this hearing is going to look like next week. Mixed opinions. First, it started off with 3 different hearings. And this is straight from the chairman's mouth to me. But now we're finding out 11. So I guess we're just deciding that the state of North Dakota shouldn't have a voice in this. I guess that's what we've done. And Florida and others in California just don't have a voice in this. Don't tell me this is the best we can get. And also, as I was reminded earlier, and as the chairman reminded me on several occasions earlier when we had these kind of hearings, he leaned over to remember, witnesses don't get to dictate terms. I guess Chairman Schiff gets to dictate terms, and the witness gets to dictate terms. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady, for what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I make my remarks, I just want to respond to some of my colleagues across the aisle. What you hear is not necessarily passion. When you hear us voicing our concern for children being detained, it is outrage. Outrage that so many of our colleagues refuse to stand up for what is right and instead try to use the criminalization of immigrants to score political points with your base. And that is something that is just a very low point in our government. So I just want to stand here before you to support the authorization of subpoenas because it is vital to extracting basic information from this administration. What we know right now is that this administration has instituted cruel, inhumane policies against migrants, children, and families. Thousands of people are being held in overcrowded facilities at the border. We have seen the horrific images of children being held in cages, sleeping in concrete floors. Families continue till this day to be separated. What we do not know is how these detention facilities are being run, what is actually going on at these camps, and what the administration plans on doing to make sure that migrants and their children are safe, or when they're going to stop detaining kids in cages. Now, Homestead, the Homestead Detention Facility is in my district, and I have visited that detention facility now several times. I have made multiple requests for information about what is happening inside the detention facility. I have asked about the camp's hurricane plan. Last week, I sent a letter for information on 51 different points about the conditions at Homestead. Have I received any answers? No. What I have received is conflicting messages from different agencies. In June 26, there was a press release where HHS said that at the end of May, there were 2,200 kids being held at Homestead in a prison-like facility. Most of these kids, about 80% of these kids, have family members right here in the United States. However, they are being detained by a for-profit company because it is to their incentive to keep these kids locked up. They're making close to $2 million a day by keeping these kids locked up in a for-profit detention facility. So I don't want to hear that the administration is running out of funding to deal with the crisis in the border when they're paying $775 per kid at the Homestead Detention Facility. And then we see kids that have no toothbrushes, no blankets. It is ridiculous. Now, what these kids are going through is so shocking that the Center for Human Rights and Constitutional Law filed a motion at the end of May in support to enforce the Flores Settlement Agreement because they are in violation of the Flores Settlement Agreement. Some of what we read in the motion is very disturbing. The Homestead Detention Facility has a no-touching policy. And here's a statement from a child who was held at Homestead. The rules here that you can't touch anyone. Sometimes when your friend is crying because they can't stand being here any longer, you want to be able to give them a hug. But you can't because it's against the rules. Another child described her constant sadness at the camp. I often feel sad and depressed here. I am accustomed to getting hugs from my family and to having my family say goodnight to me. I don't have anyone to do that for me here. I cry in my room some nights. I try to distract myself by reading the Bible, listening to music, or talking with other kids. But it is most hard and sad to think about my family because I miss them a lot. We have to take into account what harm we are causing thousands of kids by this administration, and we have to remember that these are children that are being held while their families are in other places in the country waiting for them. So I would like to ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record 3 declarations of children being held at the Homestead Detention Facility that were filed as exhibits in the Flores versus Barr case in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California.
Without objection.
I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say I'm really disappointed that when Mueller comes in, I'm not going to get to question him. I was looking forward to it. I read the report. I read the unredacted report. You know, I think I'm qualified to ask questions. I was a prosecutor in the Navy, defense attorney in the Navy, practiced law in the civilian world, was a district judge. I was elected to Congress, and I just thought I would get a chance to ask Mueller questions. I also think it's completely hypocritical that we're letting a witness dictate terms to us. It's a double standard. When the Attorney General wouldn't submit himself to questioning for staff, we held strong and said he had to, and he chose not to attend. And now Mueller can come in here and just dictate terms to the committee. I think it makes us look weak. And again, I think it's inherently unfair that I don't get to ask Mueller questions. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the ranking member, Doug Collins.
Thank you. The district in Pennsylvania is absent from the table next week because of the agreement made by the majority. Again, as we continue this down this road, it's been interesting though, and I agree with a lot of the discussion. I've said this before, and nobody on our side has disagreed about having oversight here, and we're having them again next week. We're having one on 5:30 Monday, and everything that I've seen, we didn't have to subpoena them. The Inspector General showing up. You know, it's called asking. From an attorney perspective, it's called asking and trying to work with it. That's the way oversight works. And I mean, we've been given some letters that supposedly were CC'd. We don't remember the letters. So I mean, we're just continuing to find out that there's been not a lot of contact, and especially there can be no doubt that some of these on the list, especially the names, have never been contacted for the first time. But we're going to lead with subpoena. Again, let me just reiterate, this is about the table to my right in the press because they have to change the narrative. The narrative was awful going out, and now we're trying to change the narrative to reclaim what should be our complete jurisdiction, and we've just let it go because now Intel gets to do what they want to do, Chairman Schiff gets to tell us what we want to do, and that's just a problem. And there's been no discussion about that. But also it's been interesting, you know, as we go forward again on immigration and discussing this, there are things that we can do. There are things that we can work on. It would have been nice yesterday to actually have had a bill that many of us agree on, and I reluctantly voted no on it because I wanted this to actually happen. But if we'd have had a markup on it, it would have happened. And even if it had 300 and something co-sponsors on a caps bill to remove those caps, I'm all in favor of. When you go to the actual agency that's going to put this out, they say it's not workable. It was pointed out to the majority that this was an unworkable bill in many cases, and they knew this. They chose to ignore it because they had to get the bill out. A simple A simple discussion could have happened. A markup, we could have had 400 votes. Instead, we choose to put out something and tell and basically be dishonest with the tech community and some of the other country communities that we're actually passed a bill yesterday that would actually help them. It won't help you because it will not work. We want to put a bill that actually will work. But anyway, that was the bill yesterday on the floor that we worked on. I wish we could work on it again. Hopefully the Senate will see the error in some of this and we can work on it again, and hopefully that we can come back, we can all vote for it. But again, the problem we have here is I want to yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. I appreciate his time, but again, I'm sorry that you're not going to get to ask questions next week as we go.
Will gentleman yield?
I yield back.
Thank you. I yield to my my colleague.
Yeah, thank the gentleman
from Florida.
for yielding. And just to go over what's happening here with my colleagues in the majority, many of you House Judiciary Democrats have spoken up in favor of impeachment, and your speaker doesn't support impeachment. And so what she's done is she's turned other committees on you. You know, there was the reporting that came out of your conference meeting where she was saying, well, what are you going to do? Send Elijah Cummings home? What are you going to do? Send Adam Schiff home? And so what she's done to try to block your access, to try to go about your impeachment endeavor, is she's taking the time away from the bottom row of the Judiciary Committee and giving it to the Intelligence Committee. Because if you centralize the activity in the Judiciary Committee, it accelerates the argument that Chairman Nadler and many of you have made to the Speaker in your various conference meetings about how you have to do this. So I just want you all to know what she's doing to you. She's dividing the committee. She's giving your time to Intel. And, you know, we just think that that's a bad precedent. We disagree with impeachment, but it's bad for the committee, whether you're in the majority or we're in the majority, for the committee to be functionally defrocked by Intel and then doing so in a way for the Speaker to kind of maintain some tension among your caucus. So I hope you guys get it sorted out. I yield back to the gentleman.
Would gentlemen yield to me one last time? Thank you.
Yes, I yield.
And then just finishing up here, it's really interesting now. Now they're really excited about this because we're upset about it as well. And now maybe they can go use this leverage to try and get something else. Again, it's not the way you do business. You've already noticed the hearing, by the way. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important markup.
Does the gentlelady seek to strike the last word?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, seek to strike the last word.
Last word is duly struck. The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important hearing, and these subpoenas are critical to our ability to perform our oversight function. And for me in particular, these subpoenas relating to the zero tolerance policy and what's happening on the U.S.-Mexico border are especially important. As you all know, I represent El Paso, Texas, which has been ground zero for many of the Trump administration's policies of cruelty. And those policies include child separation, child detention, and they have resulted in child deaths. We have had children dying in American custody for months now. One of my colleagues just a little while ago was complaining that she perceived us as trying to undermine the president. Absolutely, absolutely. Child detention, child separation, child deaths, we are absolutely trying to undermine that. And the only way to get to the bottom of this abhorrent behavior, of these hateful policies, is by shining a light on them. I want to thank so many of my colleagues who have been to El Paso on congressional delegation visits, colleagues who've been to Homestead on congressional delegation visits. We have an obligation to get to the truth. We have an obligation to expose what is happening in the name of the U.S. government. And with regard to the subpoenas that will help us get to the bottom of Russian attacks on our democracy, Russian attacks on our country, foreign meddling in our elections, and the cover-up intended to make sure that that meddling and that those attacks don't get exposed, it's about time that we get these subpoenas. It's about time that we get this information so that we can protect our elections, so that we can protect our country and the American people against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I figured that I better speak now because I'm not going to get to speak next Wednesday. And it is unfortunate. I'm going to speak on behalf of the whole front row here. I do think it's very disappointing that our time is being given to the Intelligence Committee. There's only one of us who's on both. I commend the gentlelady for being on both. She's going to get to ask questions. But I hope that she's going to get to ask her questions because I'm not going to get to ask mine. And I'd like to be able to ask mine because I have quite a few. I was in my district over the weekend, town hall meetings, and those questions were asked by my constituents. What questions are you going to ask Robert Mueller? And I have several that I'd like to ask, and they're not funny questions. They're very serious questions. But because of the decisions of this administration, I'm not going to get to ask my questions. And you know what? My constituents deserve to be represented at this hearing because the questions, the issues that are being discussed affect my constituents. The waste of their tax dollars on the investigations, continuing to focus and try and pursue impeachment under the guise of oversight is ridiculous in the view of many of them. And after the special counsel found that there was no conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia, this committee continues to try and make that case. So I have a lot of questions for Mr. Mueller about when he determined that there was no conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. There's a lot that's not in the report that we know about. I want to find out the answers to those questions. And yes, I want to also, under the issue of immigration, try and fix the problems that are at the border. I am very glad that finally this House took action and passed aid for the humanitarian crisis at the border because this president was calling for an aid package back in May. And this House did nothing to pass legislation until just a few weeks ago when, after there was a bipartisan bill that came over from the Senate, this House determined that they were going to pass a partisan bill out of the House and delay that aid for that humanitarian crisis. And it was only after this majority and this speaker realized that that was going to further delay into the July 4th recess, into July, possibly into August, and after August, before any kind of conference could be convened and worked out with the Senate-passed bill, did the speaker yield and pass the Senate-passed version. I'm glad that they did. I was proud to vote for it because aid is now being delivered to the border to assist in that humanitarian crisis. I've been saying since day one that there is a humanitarian crisis on the border. Many of us on this side have been pleading with the speaker to take action in a comprehensive way to address not just the humanitarian crisis, but the enforcement of our borders, which is an emergency. Thankfully, the president declared an emergency at the border. Long before anybody on the other side acknowledged that there was an emergency, we have testimony from folks on the other side ridiculing members of this side of the aisle for declaring an emergency at the border, mocking. And to set the record straight is important on who was calling it an emergency, who was calling for action to address this crisis, and who only reluctantly has come to the table and said, okay, now we're going to vote to provide aid to address this crisis at the border. So we need to set the record straight. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield to Mr. Gomer.
Yeah, thank you. And in that same vein of setting the record straight, we heard earlier that only 13 months ago, for the first time ever, did any member of Congress go talk to people that were being detained And I did that numerous times during the Obama administration. They're in the same facilities that were built back then. They weren't adequate then. They're not adequate now. But that's been going on for years. Apparently, some of my friends across the aisle just didn't know it.
The time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I think about everything that can be said has been said, except for the fact that the ranking member referred to the possible witnesses, Mr. Lewandowski, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kushner, et cetera, as being underlings of Mr. Mueller. They are not underlings of Mr. Mueller.
With the gentleman yield.
They are not underlings.
I did not say that. That is not true. I never missed.
I have the floor.
The gentleman from Tennessee controls the time.
They are not underlings of Mr. Mueller. They are direct witnesses of possibly obstruction of justice. And therefore, if they need to be subpoenaed, they need to be here, and they need to have as much time as possible. It is so important that we get the direct witnesses, the best evidence to obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice of should Mr. McGahn go and tell Mr. Mueller that he's fired? Direct witnesses of people who might have gone to Mr. Sessions and said, unrecuse yourself. Direct witnesses of people who might have had knowledge of Mr. Trump dictating a note to say, I'm the greatest ever, and Mr. Sessions should limit this work to simply what happened in the next election and not my election. Direct evidence of Mr. Pecker and buying the silence of Ms. Stormy Daniels. Direct evidence of obstruction of justice with Mr. Pecker being able to tell us about possibly Miss August and what happened with her and why they paid her off after the president said, I know nothing about this, I have never heard of this, I'd never paid any money, I've never heard of these people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not underlings, they're direct witnesses to crimes that this committee has a responsibility to oversee and bring forth if they do exist to the American people. And Mr. Mueller will do that too, because he had 4 or 5 instances of obstruction of justice minimum where all 3 elements were met, and but for the opinion of the legal office in the Justice Department that the sitting President of the United States cannot be indicted for a crime, he would have been indicted for a crime. He would have been, just as he is in New York State, number 1, and he would be with Michael Cohen. He was an unindicted co-conspirator. And we've got that situation. And as far as the border, there's issues. We shouldn't have to learn about the border from Facebook posts of agents that talk about members of Congress in sexually suggestive terms. That's not where we should be getting our information. We should be getting it directly from people. And if the folks from ICE and the folks from our Border Patrol, and there are a lot of great folks working there, can come and give us good information, they clear that up, that's great. And if they can't, that's fine too. Mr. McClintock's right, there are good people working there, but it's not going to hurt to have them testify because there's been a lot of information that says otherwise, and there's a lot of information about inhumane conditions at the border. So these subpoenas should be issued. We should do our job, which we did not do when the Republicans were in charge. We did no oversight. The only oversight they really did was Benghazi, 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 Benghazi. So I appreciate that, and I yield
Would the
some
gentleman
time
yield?
to the chairman.
I
No, you don't. And I yield to Ms. Escobar, and I'm going to go to the border with her on August 1st, and I think it's great what you're doing, and we need to go see it for ourselves. And I yield.
lady from Texas.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Cohen. And I'd invite any of my colleagues to join me on any of the congressional delegation visits, please. I want to clarify something, a myth that is being perpetrated over and over and over again that needs to stop. This idea that the Democratic Party somehow was in denial about what was happening on the U.S.-Mexico border is really offensive. Here's what we were saying. We were saying that we saw the challenge facing us. I saw the challenge facing us. I saw it up close at my front door, my community. When it became a crisis is when this administration chose to implement policies that were cruel. That's why it's a humanitarian crisis. This country has incredible resources. DHS has incredible resources. It's not a question of resources, it's a question of will. Thank you. I yield back.
And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Alabama seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to ask you a question.
Yes.
For the benefit of your members and ours on both sides of the aisle, I'd like for you to lay out for us what exactly, with respect to the Mueller hearing next week, what exactly you agreed to, and most importantly, why you agreed to it.
I'm not going to comment on that at this hearing. It is beyond the scope of this hearing.
All right, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentlelady yielding.
Let me just correct. It's not a hearing, it's a markup. It's beyond the scope of this markup.
I guess wondering why half the committee can't answer what questions next week is beyond the scope of a markup, but that's fine. But Mr. Cohen, and I appreciate Mr. Cohen, we have done a lot of things together, but he's entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. I have never said underling today. It's not something that I typically use, not said that. So he can find it from someone else that may have said it, but you do not attribute that to the ranking member, and that didn't happen. This is a whole different issue we're dealing with. But also it goes back to something that was said earlier, because we were actually sent letters saying we've actually outreached, because I made in my opening statement that a lot of this has never been outreached. Let's show you how important immigration was to this majority. That in January they reached out, the next reach out was May. The next formal reach out was May 20th or 29th, around that time. That's how long it took to reach back out on an issue that is of very much importance. And we agree that it's important, but let's don't become all of a sudden saying it's just, you know, something that we need to do subpoenas on that we've not followed up. Even if you've not followed up on it, you've not sent that. It from January to May tells me that there was other things on your mind. When we understand this, the interesting thing also is the fact that, again, with facts being facts, Mr. Cohen will get to ask questions next week. I don't think you're going to get to, Mr. Raskin. And you're good. Shame you got left out. And also, we can't get a reason why either. I think the interesting thing today is this is just a continuing free fall of process in this committee. And that's the sad part that we have today. With that, I yield to the gentleman from Florida.
The gentlelady from Texas, in her prior claim of time, said it was offensive to assert that Democrats were in denial about the crisis on the border. I would invite my Democratic colleagues to go to my official Twitter account, where I have posted an interview from January 9th, 2019. It was on CNN, not exactly a hostile network for you folks. And it's, well, let me just play what the question was. And it's Jim Clyburn, the Democratic whip, answering the question.
The president said there's a humanitarian crisis at the border, is there?
Absolutely not.
The president said there's a humanitarian crisis at the border, is there?
Absolutely not.
The president said there's a humanitarian crisis at the border, is there?
Absolutely not.
The president said there's a humanitarian crisis at the border, is there?
Absolutely not.
The president said there's a humanitarian
Point of order.
crisis at the border, is there?
Absolutely not.
The president said there's a humanitarian crisis at the border, is there?
Absolutely.
Just, I guess it's a parliamentary inquiry. Is it appropriate for a member to just put on a loop a teeny soundbite out of context? Is that allowed?
The gentleman controls the time. I'm not aware of any rule that would preclude him from doing so.
Thank you.
Gentleman is...
Thank you. I think I still control the time. And I just think that's quite something. That when you're fed back your own words from your own leadership from earlier this year, you think that's out of context and inappropriate and not allowed. Again, we didn't raise the issue. It was the gentlelady from Texas that said, these allegations from Republicans that we were in denial, they're offensive. We've always known of the crisis. And the Democratic whip laughed. Absolutely not. Laughed. Thought it was laughable. Thought it was funny. You know who doesn't think it's funny? the Trump administration, because Secretary McAleenan has been ringing the warning bell for months about the crisis. He begged you all to take action more quickly. One of the reasons why so many young people, so many vulnerable people are in tragic conditions is because we didn't act when the administration wanted us to provide funding that was absolutely necessary to care for people. And so it is appropriate to question why we are in these conditions, but it wasn't the Republicans that were in denial. It was all of you, and it was in your own words from your own leadership. Be offended with the Democratic whip, not House Republicans. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
It's actually my time. He's yielding back
Lady
to
from
me.
Alabama.
I'll yield the last 12 seconds to Mr. McClintock.
Just to fill in a few gaps, Speaker Pelosi called the situation a fake crisis at the border. Chuck Schumer called it a crisis that does not exist. Denny Hoyer said there's no crisis at the border. Hakeem Jeffries said there's no crisis at the border. Our chairman said there is no crisis at the border. I could go on, but I see the time's expired.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of the amendment in the nature of a substitute so that we can issue subpoenas and get at this zero tolerance policy and other separation, family separation policies of this administration. And I've been listening to all of the crocodile tears being shed about the inability to question Mueller. I have sat through the reverse psychology and the psychological operations that some folks are trying to play, and but it does not detract the American people away from this administration's shamed action in implementing inhumane practices at our border. President Trump publicly announced this time last year that this family separation policy was over. And that was after his administration had stated repeatedly that there was no family separation policy. And since that time, we've seen the effects of the child separation policy with children, hundreds of children, if not thousands, being lost to their parents. We don't know how many children there are that remain in these $775 a night facilities, being inadequately housed, being inadequately fed, being inadequately clothed, being inadequately cared for in terms of toothpaste, toothbrushes, hand towels, the basic stuff that you give to even prisoners of war. These child detainees are being deprived of, and it's all part of the, we talk about the military-industrial complex. Well, we have a prison-industrial complex in this country. It consists of the private for-profit prison industry and the Department of Homeland Security, which is its government supplier of goods. Who are the goods? It's the children of the immigrants. And they're being treated worse than POWs. This administration has shamed America in the eyes of the rest of the world. We've heard stories about children dying in the care of Border Patrol, men, women, and children arriving at our border seeking asylum from places like Honduras, where we support their military, where their military is engaged in drug smuggling, where the military is engaged in gang killings, rapes, terrorism, driving those folks from their own countries and forcing them to come to our borders. We're supporting that. And then when they get here and claim asylum, we're stopping them from claiming asylum. We turn our backs on them, and those who we can lock up, we fill up our private for-profit detention facilities with them, and then we ask the taxpayers for more money, claiming that there is a crisis at the border. Well, there is a crisis at the border. It's of the Trump administration's own making, and it's been aided and abetted by
people here in Congress who sit here as if they were hand puppets and saying what the administration wants them to say. And then we get here today when we're talking about bringing some of these administration officials here, and we get claims, we get righteously indignant claims about, I'm not going to be able to question Mueller. Not one person on the other side of the aisle has voiced any displeasure with the way that the children are being treated at our border. It's really stunning where we are on this committee. I think Congress needs to act swiftly to stymie this ongoing crisis. Members of Congress who want to visit migrants in detention facilities are being turned away from these detention facilities that we are paying hundreds of millions of dollars to fund. It's not fair, it's not right, it's not just. We need to bring it to an end. That's why I support this amendment, and with that, I yield back the remaining 1 second of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for a unanimous consent statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and, oh, I'm sorry.
I said the gentlelady from Texas.
There are two. I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record an article of the New York Times, Trump urged Homeland Security official to close border despite an earlier promise of delay, April 12, 2019, and an article dated June 21st, 2019. There is a stench, soiled clothes, and no baths for migrant children at a Texas center, the New York Times. I ask unanimous consent to submit that into the record.
Without objection, those articles will be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentlelady from California for a unanimous consent statement.
I just would ask unanimous consent that my statement indicating that I was in the Science Committee this morning on a very important hearing on climate change was the only reason why I was not able to be here this morning, and I counted on my colleagues to articulate the reason why we need this information from the department and these witnesses.
Without objection, the statement will be entered into the record. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Without the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I honestly don't know where to start, so I'll start in responding to the gentleman from the other side of the aisle on basically insinuating that Republicans don't care about the humanitarian crisis at the border when 176 Republicans voted for the border humanitarian supplemental and 129 Democrats voted against it or voted for it. So there's more Republicans that voted for the border humanitarian funding than Democrats were. So I don't understand this auspice that we as Republicans don't care about the humanitarian crisis on the border. I think it's absolute. You know, I've only been in Congress 6 months. I came from a state legislature, served 8 years in the state legislature in Florida, and I chaired the Florida Senate Judiciary Committee in a state where there's 22 million people, and never as the chairman of the Florida Senate Judiciary Committee would I have ever disallowed members of my committee, in the minority or in the majority, to not have the opportunity to question a witness of such import as Bob Mueller. So it's my understanding, as of yesterday, I was told that we would have a closed-door session after the open-door session where members who aren't in the famous 11 to be able to question would have the opportunity to question him in a closed-door setting. So at least we would have an opportunity as members of this committee to ask him the important questions that I think every member of this committee should have the opportunity to ask him. I would think even my colleagues who came in my class as in the Democrats are a little upset by the fact that they're not going to have the opportunity to ask one of the biggest witnesses that has been brought to this committee that everybody's been talking about on both sides of the aisle for the last 6 months, and ask them what questions they feel is important. Just like I have a background that lends itself to asking tough, challenging questions, Mr. Armstrong, Mr. Klein, both good litigation attorneys, Mr. Rushenthaler, who was also a JAG with me and served around the same time frame, those people have the opportunity and should have the opportunity to properly question a witness before this committee. And I'm very, very troubled by the fact that the United States House of Representatives Judiciary Committee, where this chairman has spoken on several different news syndicates about impeachment, and the impeachment proceedings start from this very committee, every committee member on this committee is not going to have the opportunity to question one of the biggest witnesses who opined on the Mueller report. And I think that's very, very distasteful.
and flies in the face of the 5-minute rules and the rules of this House, the rules of this committee, and the 5-minute rules that allows members of this committee to ask important questions to important witnesses here. I just think it's a travesty, and I look forward to supporting those 11 that get the opportunity to speak. And I would yield my time to any Republican member. I will yield my time to Mr. Gates of Florida.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. And having heard the concern of my colleagues who won't have the opportunity to ask questions, I wonder if there's a way for us to work together to maybe solve that. Mr. Chairman, would the chairman entertain a request, or would the chairman be likely to entertain a request to perhaps go from a 5-minute rule to a 3-minute rule so that we could get more members involved in the questioning?
The rules of the House and the rules of the committee provide for a 5-minute rule. Nothing prevents members on a voluntary basis from yielding time.
Yeah, I don't expect us to sort this out here on this markup, but
That's my observation.
yeah, but would the chairman be willing to enter into negotiations with the minority about perhaps a unanimous consent rule package before the Mueller hearing to maybe reduce the amount of time and increase the member participation? I'm not asking the chairman to commit to it, but will the chairman entertain those negotiations with the minority?
The chairman will entertain any reasonable discussions.
Well, I would encourage my colleagues then on the Democratic side who might want to ask questions, to work with us and see if there's a way to create more member participation, even if that means shortening the question time. So look forward to working with you on it, and I yield back to my colleague from Florida.
I yield back to the ranking member.
I think the interesting thing here is it's sort of sad that we're having to sit here and even discuss this, and lowering time is not. Let's go back to the actual rules of the House, which I'll pose the question, ask the chairman again if he would like to explain. How do you actually expect to stop the hearing next week?
I'm going to repeat what I said a few minutes ago. This line of discussion, frankly, is beyond the scope of this markup, and I'm not going to comment further.
That's pretty interesting.
I'm taking my time back.
I have been, excuse me, let me continue. I have been very...
It's my time. I reclaim my time. This is my time.
The gentleman asked me a question. I have been very lenient in permitting people to discuss the procedures at the Mueller hearing at length, which is beyond the scope of this markup, but I'm not going to comment on it further.
This is my last opportunity, reclaiming my time again, and I lost 30 seconds of it.
The gentleman will be granted his 30 seconds.
It is my understanding, because this is the only markup that we're going to have before Mueller, that us here on the bottom row are going to have the opportunity to bring this issue up in a public setting and talk about it. So I absolutely have the right to bring it up right now in this markup to talk about the fact that myself and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who aren't in the famous 11 that are going to get the opportunity to talk, don't have the opportunity to ask questions to Bob Mueller, one of the biggest witnesses coming to this committee. And we absolutely have the right to discuss this today, because this is the last opportunity that we have to discuss it before he's coming in before a hearing.
The gentleman yield back?
I yield back to the ranking member.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized. For what purpose is the gentlelady from... All right. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to thank you for your leadership on this issue. I think it's very important that we move forward. I know there's been a lot of discussion about a lot of different things, and like my neighbor next door here, Mr. Neguse, I just want to get us back in focus that this is really about the subpoenas, and it means that to me, I've heard the word subpoena binge. It's not a subpoena binge. It's about taking action for accountability for the American people. It's about action. It's not about a binge. It's about accountability. It's about the rule of law. It's about the Constitution. And those of us here at this table as a voice for the American people that elected us to be here. I find it disheartening to hear some of the discussion that's been going on because we're losing focus. We're not keeping our eye on the ball, and that is to make sure that we know what happened, why it happened, and we do everything we can to protect the American people, the Constitution, and to ensure that it never, ever happens again. As to this issue about the border, I've been working with my colleague from Texas, Representative Escobar, on these issues for many, many years. She is a county judge of El Paso County, and I as a state senator. So for anyone to suggest that we are not doing our part as Democrats to recognize the situation is just flagrantly not true. I think for us, the loss of life at the southern border should be reason enough for us to do something. Congress has no choice but to subpoena the necessary documents and testimony to fulfill our oversight duties. Furthermore, the growing number of deaths, as she's outlined, in custody of our young children underscore the need for oversight of the administration's cruel and inhumane immigration policies. The committee has a responsibility to investigate the administration's family separation policy, its detention policies, and any other policy that undermines the acts of humanity. These are acts against humanity. They're acts against human rights standards. They're acts that really just shock the conscience. We should, frankly, Mr. Chairman, acted the first time that there was a death in custody. Now there's been a second and a third and a fourth. I forget the count now. I think it's 8. We need to look at it and look at it from top to bottom and do everything we can to make sure that we protect these children. Children belong in cradles. They do not belong in cages. My constituents elected me to be here as a voice for them. And my constituents want action, they want responsibility, and that's what we're here to do, and that's what this committee's charged to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yield to
Would
me.
the gentlelady yield?
The gentlelady yield to me.
Certainly.
I thank the gentlelady. I want to comment on some of the discussion we've had in the last few minutes. The purpose of this markup, the subject matter of this markup, are subpoenas to deal with 2 very, very serious subjects. One is the child abuse and, frankly, negligent homicide going on at the border by this administration. And we have to get to the bottom of it, and that's why we want these subpoenas. And the other is the flagrant abuses of power, obstruction of justice, also by this president. And we have to get to the bottom of that, and that's the subject of the subpoenas before us. The question of the procedure at a hearing that we're going to hold is an important question, but it is not the subject of this markup. And although I've permitted people to talk about it, and they can continue, I'm not going to add to the diversion of attention from the 2 crucial subjects that we have here, which is the child abuse and, as I said, negligent homicide and systematic torture of children.
Now, we're stopping. We're
No,
stopping.
we're not stopping.
Yes,
I will
we're
finish
stopping.
my statement.
No, that
is
this
going on-
completely out of order. Bang it all you want. It's
It is
completely
not
out of order.
You are out of order. If you have an objection, you'll state it in a moment.
Well, I have.
Then
Plenty
I'll
today.
recognize you in a moment. But the subject of this hearing is the child abuse and other and abuse going on at the border, and the abuses of power by the president. Excuse me. The subject is the
Point of
by
order.
the administration.
Point of order.
The gentleman will state
Point
his
of
point
order.
of order.
I move to take the gentleman's words down.
Which words?
We'll take a timeout while we discuss it. You can't do this, and you can't who you've accused of crime, then you turn to administration.
I didn't accuse anybody.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. The words that I'm objecting to are the systematic use by the president to obstruct justice. You cannot use those words.
I will withdraw those words, and I'll say the systematic use of power by the president by the administration to defy the subpoenas of this committee and other committees. And I'll ask unanimous consent to withdraw the previous words. Without objection, they're withdrawn. to summarize, the purpose of this markup is to consider the child abuse and other terrible things happening at the border and the subjects that we discussed a moment ago by the administration, and to issue subpoenas to get to the bottom of both of them. And I'm not going to comment on anything that is beyond the scope of this markup. I yield back to the gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, I totally agree with you, and I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe House Democrats need to take a hint from the American people. The vast majority of the American people do not support this impeachment and drag that continues to fester up in the House Judiciary Committee. I would suggest that you need to move on issues that impact the lives of the American people, not your own politics and the affliction of your own Trump derangement syndrome. During the last Congress, it was all about the Mueller report. Didn't matter that committees in the House and Senate had found that there was no criminal conspiracy with Russia. We just had to keep calling the president an agent of a hostile foreign power while we waited for the Mueller report. Well, then we get the Mueller report. Mueller report concludes that there is no criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. Well, then it can't be about the written word of the Mueller report. Then we got to get Mr. Mueller here. He's got to be here. He's got to bring it to life with his words. So very well, we prepare. No Republicans objected to Mr. Mueller coming. He's on his way next week. But now we're here voting on these subpoenas because it still won't end with Mueller's testimony. Even if Mueller comes and answers your questions, you already know that you want to bring in these 12 additional witnesses regardless of what Mr. Mueller says. So it sort of begs the question, why are you bringing Mueller in the first place if this is never going to be over? And that's really the message to the American people. They're never going to get over this, okay? They couldn't deal with the fact that Donald Trump won the election when all the media pundits and all the Democrat talking heads said he had zero chance to win. Remember, he was supposed to lose 100 million to zero, according to the FBI lovebirds, but he wins. They can't deal with it, and so then they have to go delegitimize the presidency through all of these endeavors, and now we've got the dispositive proof. I don't think there are any Americans who truly believe there was a criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia who are not Democrat members of Congress. And so now we are in a circumstance where the only way to get them to not focus on this Trump-Russia stuff is to take them out of power. Because as long as they have the committee gavels, this is the deal, this is the show. There could be endless hearings, endless reports that the president wasn't engaged in a criminal conspiracy. I tend to think that the more productive endeavor is to figure out why in the heck the president was falsely accused for 2 years. How did we get to a point where political opposition research, dirt that was paid for by Democrats, polluted by Russians, shuttled into the senior levels of our government by deep state actors like Bruce and Nellie Orr, how did all of that function as a basis to divide us and distract us? The gentlelady who spoke earlier said, we're losing focus. Yeah, we're definitely losing focus. We should be focused on reducing prescription drug prices. We should be focused on the nearly 5,000 people who show up every day at the southern border that the Trump administration has been talking about. We should be focused on ways to limit burdens on Americans so that they can live the full potential of their lives. But they'll never get over it. There will never be an end for them. And that's what's truly sad, because we got 300 million plus Americans who are counting on us to be the people's house, to do the work that rises to the great virtue of the greatest country that has ever lived. And when I hear my colleagues talk about humanity and being humane, just think about the fact that it was your own whip, Mr. Clyburn, who laughed, chuckled, when asked about the humanitarian crisis that was building on the border. It's like you guys didn't even hear that. You just launched off into your talking points. I think I heard the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, say that Republicans were using psychological operations on the Democrats in the committee. I guess he was referring to me. When we feed you your own words back from your own leadership, if you consider that a psychological operation, I deeply apologize. We're merely trying to point out the inconsistency of the positions you've held in an effort to try to get you to work with us and to try to reform our asylum laws. And by the way, we'll do it with you in a bipartisan way. Your own colleague, Mr. Gonzalez from Texas, he's introduced a great bill to force people to seek asylum in their home countries. Instead of just sitting here and talking about the border and you guys cry harder or we cry harder or you laugh harder or whatever, that is not productive for anyone, but your own members have bills that would help us solve these problems and you won't bring them up for a vote. And they're bills that have bipartisan co-sponsorship. So save us the lectures on humanity, because there is nothing humane about the fact that children in Central America are being stolen, rented, trafficked, and then sent right back across the border to do it all over again. That's what's inhumane. And that's what these asylum laws allow for. Children being used like a fast pass into this country. It's despicable, and you have the ability to bring bills forward to fix it, and you should do it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the truth is I don't know where to start responding to inaccurate rhetoric or to just talk about how sad and embarrassing today is. And we're arguing about a humanitarian crisis that is created by Donald Trump. Families have a lawful right to seek asylum. They're presenting themselves. And the question is why? It's because they're fleeing some very harsh circumstances. And what we as Americans have yet to do is to acknowledge and accept our role in the circumstances that they face. The cartels, the fact that we buy a majority of the drugs that are made over there. We contribute to the despicable conditions that they're trying to flee from. It was also mentioned here that there were giants that chaired this committee. Truth is, there were giants that were on this committee. But what made them giants is the fact that they stood up for justice, no matter which team was doing the injustice, that they never deferred their moral compass to a person without one, to a person who from day one when he announced his candidacy smeared immigrants as rapists and gang members. And if you don't have the courage to stand up to prejudice, bigotry, and bullying, you can't seek to claim to be a giant. That is the courage, in my neighborhood, we would say, the backbone of a wet noodle. But I want to do this. My favorite movie, and for the lawyers in the room, they probably know it, the movie A Time to Kill with Samuel Jackson. And in the closing argument, Matthew McConaughey asked the jury, and I'm going to ask the members of this committee, do the same thing. He asked them to close their eyes. And when you close your eyes, I want you to think about children that are held without enough food. I want you to think about children who don't have toothbrushes. Close your eyes and think about children who go days without showers in overcrowded conditions, wearing soiled clothes, no diapers, lack of medicine, sleep deprived. And I want you to vision those children. Now I want you to envision those children if they were white. What would we be doing? And if the answer in your mind is the exact same thing, then bless your heart. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania, for what purpose does she seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in support, strong support of your amendment, Mr. Chairman. It's very important that we zero in on the zero tolerance policy and the family separation policies and practices. It's very important that we take a look at and expose the conditions of the detention of children, families, adults, women.
I had the sad privilege on July the 1st and July the 2nd to travel to the border. On July the 1st, thanks to Veronica Escobar, who put together a codel of congressional people, we visited El Paso. We visited adult women in El Paso Border Station 1. And I'm going to quote John Lewis, because he visited Homestead with us also. He said, "We've come to learn and to bear witness." What we saw there, what we were able to bear witness to, is inhumanity and incompetence by this administration over the separation of children and the detention of immigrants. In one small, cold cell that we got access to, there were 15 women from Cuba. They had been held for 56 days. When we said, "When did you come into this cell?" they said, "Only today." They had been in tents or other outside temporary conditions for 56 days. Their lips were cracked with exposure, with lack of water. It was a cell, a prison cell. I counted the cinder blocks, 10 by 13, concrete floor. They were lying in blue sleeping bags. We asked, when did they get the sleeping bags? They said only recently, a donation from the Forestry Service. Prior to that, they had been using those Jiffy Pop blankets out in the elements, out in the exposure. When we took a look at the stainless steel toilet for 15 women with no lid on the toilet, we flushed it and it worked, but the sink above it did not work. And when we asked about that, they said, "Oh yeah, we put in a slip for that." And the women told us they were instructed to drink out of the toilet because that was clean enough water. We came to bear witness. 3 of the women were sick, 2 with epilepsy, 1 with a brain aneurysm. A 4th woman asked me to touch her back because she had a profound lump on her back, but there was no time to help her get the biopsy or treatment or diagnosis she might need. One woman, 58, they all cried, by the way, a hopeless kind of a cry, scared 56-day-long kind of a cry. I'll move on to when we went to Clint, where we saw 25 children in a facility that 2.5 weeks ago had 250 children, and 2.5 months ago had 700 children, a facility that was meant for 106 male adults. Picture what that must have looked like before they moved out all those children because Congress was coming to see them.
Mr. Chairman, the committee is not in order.
Gentleman is correct. The committee will come back to order.
In Clint, we were not allowed to talk to the children, so we went to the prison door where they were being held, 6 children in one cell, for example. We tried to say who we were. We're Congress. We're here to help you. I held up a simple note. I said, "We love you. We heart you." The guard yelled at me, chided me, "Don't communicate. You have no business communicating." And then the children slipped a note out to us. Again, the guard was annoyed, thinking we were slipping something into the children. And the children said to us, when it was translated, "How can we help you?" How can they help us? They retained their humanity as the guards' humanity was ebbing away. And then we went to Homestead, where 2,296 children, at the time we visited on July the 2nd, are being held for profit. And it was a beautiful facility. They wanted us to see a massive auditorium, twice the size of this, empty. A massive cafeteria, 3 times the size of this, empty and not a smell of food, just a chef in a chef's coat telling us of the great food they prepare. Of the 2,300 kids that were there, we got to see about 30 of them. And John Lewis movingly spoke to them and talked about this country in a better place and a better way and how they were welcome. I say this to say, if you can't get the inhumanity of it, get the incompetence of it. This administration has been utterly incompetent in the detention of immigrants, of children, and it will be judged by it. We must do our oversight. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to rise in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I want to express my strong support for the subpoenas.
both in relation to the zero tolerance policy, the separation of children at the borders, and the miserable conditions of confinement that exist in many of the border detention facilities. I also want to express my support for the subpoenas related to potential presidential abuse of the pardon process, and I want to express my strong support for the subpoenas related to obstruction of justice and other potential crimes committed during the 2016 presidential election and detailed in Special Counsel Mueller's report. I want to first start by saying that there's a very important principle here that I would have thought unified the Judiciary Committee, which is that the House of Representatives has a fact-finding function which is adjacent to and auxiliary to and implied by our lawmaking function. And the Supreme Court has said it repeatedly. Other courts have endorsed the idea repeatedly. We cannot pass the laws we need relating to immigration or obstruction of justice or anything unless we can obtain the information that we want, the information that we need in order to legislate. James Madison said that those who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. And the people, through Article 1 of the Constitution, gave us the power to obtain information. Our colleagues across the aisle know it. They use that power expansively, proudly, some would say promiscuously, with their repeated expenditure of tens of millions of dollars related to the Benghazi investigation or Fast and Furious or Hillary Clinton's emails, whatever. You know what? That was their constitutional power. It was our constitutional power to do it. And this is our constitutional power to obtain all of the information that we are seeking from this administration, and yet the President of the United States has pulled a curtain down over the executive branch of government, ordering his subordinates to defy the lawful orders of the Congress of the United States. I would hope that every member of this committee would stand up for our powers, our prerogatives, and our rights under Article 1 as the people's representatives in the lawmaking branch of government. Now, let me talk specifically about what's happening at the border, because yesterday, Mr. Chairman, the Oversight Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, we had a hearing. And I took some notes, so I'm just going to read some of the words I wrote down from the eyewitnesses who are working day in and day out on it. Widespread flu, chicken pox, scabies, lice, inconsolably crying sick children, sexual harassment, sexual assault, huge lines at the infirmary where children with serious medical complications and conditions are turned away. And then we heard about the horrible, inexorable, inevitable, dreadful, and irreversible outcome of these terrible conditions. 6 children dying under the care and the custody of the United States government. Yesterday, we heard from Yasmin Juarez, a lovely young woman whose 3-year-old daughter, Marie, died after contracting a respiratory infection that remained untreated for a very long time as she begged for medical assistance and attention. And by the time she got out and went to the emergency room to the hospital, it was too late for poor Marie. And her mother said she was coming forward because she does not want to see any other mother or father or family go through this nightmare. But I'm also standing up strong for the subpoenas related to the Mueller report and all of these witnesses, John Kelly and Lewandowski and Rod Rosenstein and Jeff Sessions, Mr. Chairman. We heard when we started from one of our colleagues, I think it was Mr. Chabot, I couldn't see who's behind me, but I think he began with now the appalling mantra which the Attorney General and the President have spread across the country of no obstruction found by the Attorney General, no collusion found by the Special Counsel. Well, we know both of those things are not true. If you read pages 1 and 2 of the report, Special Counsel Mueller says we don't deal with the question of collusion, which is not a criminal law concept, it's an antitrust law concept, and they record more than 150 different encounters between the Trump campaign and emissaries of the Russian government and Russian nationals. And so there's lots of evidence of collusion. The special counsel said there was not sufficient evidence to charge criminal conspiracy, which I never thought there was, because Vladimir Putin did not need Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr. to execute his plot against the American elections in 2016. All the Trumps could do was mess it up, which they did because they blew the cover on the whole operation. That's the reality of this situation. But did the Trumps call the FBI? Did they call the Federal Election Commission? No. They said, come on in. Let's see what we can do. I love it. I think we heard from the president's son, I love it. Let's meet. Let's see what you can give us about Hillary Clinton. Well, then, okay. Well, I was just getting started. I didn't even get to respond to my friend from Florida, but I'm happy to take some other time if anybody wants to yield. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady, for what purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I would like to yield my time to my colleague, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee from Texas, please.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank you so very much, and I first of all thank the gentlelady from Georgia for her leadership and all of my colleagues who have been superb on this issue. Let me first of all, because there has been a tone of my friends on the other side of the aisle, make it very clear that Democrats do not support open borders. That's the call for 2020, that Democrats support open borders. As I sit next to my friend, Chairwoman Loughran, we're reminded of our visits to the border in 2014 and the President Obama. Both of us were standing at night as children came off of a bus, and the administration handled it completely differently. It was not perfect, but they understood that they would not get the reputation that the United Nations has declared abominable. In the eyes of the world, the actions of this administration, the Trump administration, are abominable, without mercy, without care. And it is imperative that this committee that holds the highest ideals of investigation of this Congress, the Judiciary Committee, over the decades of its incorporation, 1789, as I recall, that this committee has set to do justice. And I believe it is curious, if I might say so, that first of all, the President of the United States are pushing law enforcement to do raids, to conspicuously announce national raids, to create a massive hysteria and danger for officers and those, and to create more unaccompanied children. Because the creation of unaccompanied children are not just those who come across, but as I was told at the border, oh yes, they're unaccompanied because we've taken their family away. So you take their family away from Houston and San Francisco, Chicago and New York and elsewhere, and you create unaccompanied children. And then I think it is particularly curious, and I want to thank the chairman, for the Business Insider said John Kelly's new role on a detention center board set off ethics concern that he may be profiting from the children that he proposed and supported in a zero-tolerance separation policy. Amazing. Absolutely amazing that you leave from being the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Chief of Staff of the President of the United States, promoting child separation, taking families away from their children, not being able to unite every single child with their parent who didn't speak the language and knew they were going to see their child again. And if anyone has joined me, along with other members who saw the attempt to reunite and to see these mothers coming in with a pillowcase of clothing to get children who have been separated for months, and to see the distance and the shock and the trauma of that child not even responding to that mother who was coming longing to be reunited, the few that were lucky enough to be reunited, and the child not responding because they had been traumatized. Secretary Kelly, you leave from this administration and go right to the actors who are in the midst of devastation and separating our children. My colleague from Texas knows that we have something called Emancipation Center in our collective areas that we have been fighting against, that the doors are closed shut, that you can barely get up to the front yard when they are trying to remove you. We're doing the right thing, and we will not be characterized as those who promote open borders. We'll be characterized as those who are begging for comprehensive immigration reform or the right kind of response to those who want to come into this country in a legal way, and those who are here undocumented who want to seek the opportunity to be status and citizens, the very ones who have put on the uniform that I know that have gone to fight or to serve this nation. And so I hope that we can get a vote on this and that we will be able to move forward on these subpoenas so that we can do our oversight. I don't know if 11 seconds is good. The gentlelady from Georgia is not here, and I don't know if I can give them to you. You have them. 3, 2. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The question now occurs.
Roll call.
Roll call is requested. In the opinion of the chair, the roll call is withdrawn. The amendment in nature of a substitute is adopted. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to agree to the resolution as amended. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The ayes have it. The resolution as amended is agreed to.
Now roll call.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Demings? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes no.
The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
The gentlelady from Washington?
Ms. Jayapal votes aye.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 21 ayes and 12 noes.
The ayes have it. The resolution as amended is agreed to. We now have 4 bankruptcy bills, which are uncontroversial, and pursuant to agreement with the ranking member, I ask unanimous consent that we bring up the 4 bills en bloc, which means we'll take one vote and we'll save some time. Are there any objections? Hearing none, we will take up the 4 bills en bloc. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3311, the Small Business Reorganization Act of 2019, H.R. 3304, the National Guard and Reservist Debt Relief Extension Act of 2019, H.R. 2938, the Honoring American Veterans in Extreme Need Act of 2019, or the Haven Act, and H.R. 2336, the Family Farmer Relief Act of 2019. I'm going to read one statement about all 4 bills that we are about to consider, and I will ask unanimous consent to put my full statement on each bill in the record. Without objection, the Bankruptcy Code either directly or indirectly affects millions of Americans and all types of businesses, from the largest to the smallest. When the law works properly, it offers a critical economic second chance to individuals and businesses in financial distress. But various reforms are necessary to ensure that this critical goal of financial rehabilitation is effectively met. The 4 bipartisan bills scheduled for consideration of today's markup address certain deficiencies and areas of unfairness in the code. But before I turn to the first bill listed for markup, I want to briefly discuss a bill that is not part of today's proceedings, but which we will be considering in the near future, H.R. 2648, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act, which I introduced along with Senator Dick Durbin. Our legislation would address head-on the manifest unfairness that student loans, unlike every other unsecured debt such as credit cards or auto loans, are effectively non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. These measures would make student loan debt completely dischargeable. There is no reason that this one category of debt should be singled out for special treatment that severely undermines the Bankruptcy Code's vital goal of providing a financial fresh start to honest but unfortunate debtors. The problem of student loan debt, however, is multifaceted. In light of substantial interest from various stakeholders in continuing to refine the bill, and in response to the request by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we are holding off taking up H.R. 2648, at least for now. But make no mistake, we will address the student loan problem in the context of bankruptcy reform at the very next opportunity. We also plan to consider the need to promote greater transparency and integrity with respect to the ongoing financial reorganization of Puerto Rico under the guidance of the congressionally authorized Financial Oversight and Management Board, particularly with regard to actual or potential conflicts of interest of professional persons retained by the board in connection with the reorganization effort. Now, turning to the first bill listed for markup, H.R. 3311, the Small Business Reorganization Act of 2019, makes a series of reforms to current bankruptcy law needed to better facilitate the financial reorganization of small business debtors. These reforms are endorsed by the nonpartisan National Bankruptcy Conference as well as the American Bankruptcy Institute. H.R. 3311 strikes an important balance between heightened administrative oversight of these types of cases and provisions intended to streamline the bankruptcy reorganization process for small business debtors. Among its principal features, H.R. 3311 would require the appointment of an individual to serve as the trustee in a small business Chapter 11 case to monitor the debtor's reorganization progress toward confirmation of a reorganization plan. In addition, it would authorize the court to confirm a plan over the objection of the debtor's creditors under certain specified circumstances. The bill also includes 2 provisions, not limited to small business Chapter 11 cases, pertaining to the treatment of a transfer of property by the debtor made before the filing of the bankruptcy case that is preferential to a creditor and the detriment of similarly situated creditors. I thank the sponsors of this legislation, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, and the chair of the Antitrust Commercial Administrative Law Subcommittee, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for their leadership on this measure. The second bill is H.R. 3304, the National Guard and Reservist Debt Relief Extension Act of 2019. According to a 2018 financial lifestyle survey of service members and veterans, financial issues are the top lifestyle stressor, and unfortunately, bankruptcy is sometimes the best answer for those in financial distress. Under current law, National Guard members and reservists who serve on active duty are, like other active service members, exempt from the Bankruptcy Code's means test, which determines whether a debtor's income is too high to have all of his or her debts erased in bankruptcy. But this critical protection for National Guard members and reservists must be extended before it expires at the end of the year. Unless otherwise exempted, service members and veterans must complete the required forms and submit the specified paperwork to satisfy the Bankruptcy Code's means test. This requirement applies even with respect to service members who have returned to the United States from active duty and thus no longer receive combat pay. Under the means test, such service members must calculate his or her income based on the average monthly income that he or she received during the 6-month period preceding the filing date of the bankruptcy case, rather than the debtor's actual income, which may be much less because of the debtor's non-combat status. H.R. 3304 responds to this immediate concern. The bill would extend for 4 years the temporary authorization exempting certain qualifying reserve component members of the armed services and National Guard members from the Bankruptcy Code's means test. Without question, this measure warrants our support and its prompt consideration by the full House, given the impending December 19, 2019 expiration date of the means test exemption for service members and veterans. I commend the bill's sponsor, Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties Subcommittee Chair, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, as well as his co-sponsors, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for their deep commitment to supporting our nation's heroes. Accordingly, I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass H.R. 3304. The third bill is H.R. 2938, the Honoring American Veterans in Extreme Need Act of 2019, or the Haven Act. This bill addresses a fundamental unfairness in current bankruptcy law that affects veterans receiving disability benefits. Although Social Security benefits are not treated as income for purposes of the Bankruptcy Code's means test, veterans' disability benefits do constitute income under this test, even though, much like Social Security, these benefits are a lifeline to many of its recipients and are otherwise protected from seizure by creditors. By counting such benefits as income, many veterans become ineligible for the more immediate discharge available under Chapter 7, and instead, they are steered into Chapter 13, which requires a debtor to make payments to creditors pursuant to a 3- or 5-year plan before he or she can receive a discharge. H.R. 2938 corrects this obvious inequity. It would treat certain veterans' disability benefits the same as Social Security payments under the Bankruptcy Code's means test. I commend the bill's sponsor, the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, and her co-sponsor, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, for their leadership on this important legislation. The final bill is H.R. 2336, the Family Farmer Relief Act of 2019. This bill would increase the current debt limit used to determine whether a family farmer is eligible for relief under Chapter 12 of the Bankruptcy Code, a specialized form of bankruptcy relief specifically intended for family farmers, from approximately $4.4 million, the current debt limit, to $10 million. Chapter 12 permits a family farmer who satisfies certain eligibility criteria to reorganize his or her debts pursuant to a repayment plan under the supervision of a bankruptcy trustee. The special attributes of Chapter 12 make it better suited to meet the particularized needs of family farmers in financial distress than other forms of bankruptcy relief. Under Chapter 7, for example, the family farmer and its assets would have to be liquidated to pay the claims of creditors, thus depriving the family farmer of his or her livelihood. Chapter 11, typically used by large corporations to reorganize complex financial transactions, can be a costly and time-consuming process ill-suited to a small farming operation. During the farm crisis in the mid-1980s, thousands of family farmers faced a perfect storm of grain embargoes, high interest rates, competition from large corporate farming operations, and competition from overseas. In response to that crisis, Congress passed legislation creating Chapter 12, initially on a temporary basis and in 2005 on a permanent basis. Unfortunately, many similar economic pressures are currently impacting family farmers who are also facing the damaging effects of virtually unprecedented weather events, including devastating episodes of flooding as well as stagnant or falling returns on investment. H.R. 2336 takes into consideration the fact that modern farming operations entail greater costs and resulting debt than when Chapter 12 was first enacted, by raising the debt threshold to qualify for this type of bankruptcy relief to a level more consistent with today's operations. This legislation is supported by the nonpartisan American Bankruptcy Institute as well as by the American College of Bankruptcy. It currently has more than 20 bipartisan co-sponsors, including our colleague, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner. Accordingly, I support H.R. 2336. I yield back the balance of my time. I now call on the ranking member, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before I do that, without objection, these bills are considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I already recognize myself for an opening statement. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia for his statement.
And we're back. There we go. And again, I appreciate the gentleman and also the unanimous consent request that that all my statements for these bills be entered into the record.
Without objection.
All right. Also, and again, I want to thank you. Did a good job outlining these bills. I think it's a good work on our side, Mr. Klein, Ms. Stubbe, Mr. Sensenbrenner, and also on the other side as well, Mr. Cohen and others who've worked on these bills. And I'm glad to see that because passage of these 4 bills will testify that this committee can achieve for the American people on a bipartisan basis and in the important areas of law within our jurisdiction when we devote our time and effort and energies to doing what we can do in this committee, and that showed up here in the last few minutes instead of the previous 2.5 hours, which we agreed on. And also Mr. Armstrong, who has worked very hard on some of these bills as well. So we appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to yield back since we're moving forward.
The gentleman yields back. I now, for what purpose the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, seek recognition?
Thank you. I just want to thank Mr. Klein and Mr. Burchett, who are co-sponsors on our bill for the reservist and the National Guards folks to get the bankruptcy relief they've been getting for a decade, which needs to be renewed. That's H.R. 3304. These people sacrifice their jobs, oftentimes their businesses, to go to protect us and overseas fights, and they sometimes get into financial difficulty and shouldn't have to have a means test, so I appreciate the bipartisan support. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now ask unanimous consent to place a statement by Mr. Cicilline into the record. Without objection, does anyone else seek recognition? A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bills H.R. 3311, H.R. 3304, H.R. 2938, and H.R. 2336 en bloc favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bills are ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views on each bill. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.